Welcome to today's Academy for Teachers special event, Black Power, Pan-Africanist Schools, and Liberated Territories with Russell Rickford. I'm Jenna Felty-Alden, and I'm thrilled to introduce today's talk, which is part of a two-part series on the history of education. Next week, we'll feature a session led by me and my esteemed colleague, Dan Freund, called What is School For? And why we think it's important to teach the history of school to young people, especially as many of us grapple with the interweaving of race, power, and education. When Dan and I were planning our event, there was a moment when we said kind of dreamily, wouldn't it be amazing if Russell Rickford could give a talk on his book about Black power and education? It became a reality thanks to the tireless efforts of the Academy for Teachers. What a total treat. Now, a quick note about the Academy. I've been a US history teacher at Bard High School Early College Queens since 2010 and can attest that all of my favorite professional development experiences, hands down, have been with the Academy. Their virtual offerings during the pandemic have been particularly meaningful, infusions of intellectual escape at some of our most collectively exhausted moments. So a big shout out to them for inspiring teachers all year long and for putting together this thoughtful series. We can all use reminders of the radical potential of the work we do. And now, the moment we're waiting for, I am thrilled to introduce Russell Rickford. Russell and I were in grad school together at Columbia, though I was a couple of years behind him, so I'm not sure if he remembers me. But everyone there marveled at him. I remember that clearly. While most of us writing dissertations descended into vortexes of neurotic suffering, Russell approached his work with equanimity and grace. He was kind, he was impossibly prolific, he was committed to the political value of his work. Those qualities shine through in his book, We Are an African People, Independent Education, Black Power, and the Radical Imagination. This book eschews sentimentalism while reminding us that systemic change often demands the creation of revolutionary counter-institutions rather than the reform of existing ones. Russell is now Associate Professor of History at Cornell University. He's the editor of Beyond Boundaries, the Manning Marable Reader, and author of Betty Shabazz, A Life Before and After Malcolm X. Russell Rickford, thank you so much for taking the time to share your work with this esteemed crew of teachers. We are honored to be in your midst, and I know many of us will eagerly transfer your lessons to our teaching in our classrooms. I now happily turn the Zoom mic over to you.
Well, my goodness, Jenna, your kind face looked very familiar, but I didn't immediately recognize you, perhaps because you've aged like 2.5 years since grad school. So thank you so much for that generous introduction, and it's really good to see you. And thanks to the Academy of Teachers for sponsoring this talk. Special thanks to Sam Swope and Renee Marion for their patient and diligent organizing. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave you just before 6, so I want to launch right in. And so I'll share my screen. I want to leave plenty of time for us to have a conversation. All right, are you seeing that?
Yep.
Okay, yep. Great. All right, so let's begin with a quote from the West African revolutionary Amilcar Cabral of the Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde revolutions. Cabral said in 1965, he said, "Keep always in mind that the people are not fighting for ideas, for the things in anyone's head. They're fighting for material benefits to live better and in peace. National liberation and independence will remain meaningless for the people unless it brings a real improvement in conditions of life." The Pan-African nationalist renaissance of the late 1960s and early 70s generated an incredibly fertile institutional life, part of a larger outpouring of theory and culture that changed African-American politics. The contemporary flourishing of grassroots activity included attempts to remake Black America through a conversion from Negro to African. That quest included campaigns to construct what I call the African-American post-colony, a projected condition of cultural and political sovereignty. Pan-African nationalism was an approach that combined concepts of Black American nationhood with commitment to linking Black struggles worldwide. The young activist intellectuals who embraced this tendency devoted themselves to re-socializing the oppressed. Private Pan-African nationalist schools were designed to serve as instruments of conversion. They were conceived as counter institutions or enterprises capable of counteracting white cultural hegemony. And I should say Pan-African nationalism, again, an approach that combined concepts of Black American nationhood with commitment to linking Black struggles worldwide. So the creators of these schools, these Pan-African nationalist schools, strove not simply to bolster the academic skills and self-image of urban African-American youths, but also to decolonize minds, to nurture the next generation of activists, and to embody the principles of self-determination and African identity. The establishments reflected the premise that African Americans were a subjugated nation, an internal colony that needed to claim intellectual and cultural autonomy before achieving true liberation through formal statehood or community self-rule. Operators of Pan-African nationalist schools believed a quasi-colonial education had decultured African Americans, preparing them for subservience in much the same way that European empires had denatured their non-white subjects. Escaping colonial mentality meant shedding the standards and values of the oppressor. The rise of Pan-African nationalist schools in the late 60s signaled a strategic and philosophical shift, a transition from the pursuit of reform within a liberal democracy to the attempt to build the prospective infrastructure for an independent Black nation, an entity that activists imagined as a political and spiritual extension of the revolutionary Third World. Organizers of Pan-African nationalist schools believed white supremacy remained the central reality of Black existence throughout the world, even though post-war struggles had greatly expanded the scope of legal equality and civil rights. For contemporary militants, cultivating an alternative citizenship or counter-citizenship, a sense of transnational belonging that defied the cultural norms and political dictates of American empire, was a vital means of combating the psychology of the oppressed, a syndrome described by thinkers from Malcolm X to Frantz Fanon. African Americans, Pan-African nationalists insisted, were not merely another ethnic group. To realize their destiny, Black Americans needed to, quote, die a tribe and be born a nation, unquote, as the people of Southern Africa and other revolutionary territories were attempting to do. Acts of self-mastery, along with collective will to metamorphose from an oppressed minority to a sovereign people, were necessary if Black Americans were to seize the power to interpret and control their realities. All right, so this next section of my talk describes the transition from freedom to liberation. By the mid-60s, organizers of Southern freedom schools and other young activists were entering a new phase of struggle. The intellectual shift from freedom to liberation signaled a transition from efforts to redeem American democracy to attempts to arm the oppressed with the tools of self-government. Freedom evoked the civil rights ideal of equality before the law. Liberation, on the other hand, implied an uncompromising embrace of self-rule. Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity had called the Harlem Weekend School that it established in 1964 a liberation school. The institution reflected the OAAU's global outlook, its indictment of US imperialism, and its solidarity with progressive African nations. The staff members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, exemplified the transition to an insurgent politics of liberation. And actually, many of the Pan-African nationalist schools that emerged in the late 1960s can be traced back to the collapse of SNCC in the mid to late 1960s. Former SNCC workers emerged from the Southern desegregation movement and scattered to various cities, north and south. Looking to stimulate a transformation of consciousness, they and other battle-tested activists returned to the arena of education, refining theories of liberation pedagogy drawn from experiences in freedom schools, Black studies campaigns, and student protests. However, no longer preoccupied with the moral redemption of America, they pursued strategies designed to revolutionize Black culture and consciousness. Parallel institutions seemed capable of offering an alternative structure of authority, a provisional power that could replace hostile and inadequate local agencies and restore some of the social services that were vanishing from the urban core amid the cutbacks and disinvestment of the late 60s and 70s. By presenting credible alternatives that fulfilled human needs, such ventures could win the loyalty of the people, exposing the failings of the existing society and serving as tools for mass politicization. Okay, so in this next section, I discuss the shift from colony to nation, So we've gone from freedom to liberation, and now from colony to nation. So Pan-African nationalists viewed national liberation, quote unquote, as the answer to the political, economic, and cultural subordination of African Americans. The 1960s was an age of independence, when liberation struggles in Africa, the Caribbean, and other parts of the Third World culminated in the birth of new nation states. The great wave of post-World War II revolutions seemed to affirm formal self-government as the essential solution to the dependency of subject peoples. But was nationhood the ultimate metaphor for Black self-determination in the US? By the late 60s, some Pan-African nationalists were reassessing their veneration of the nation state and their wholesale embrace of post-colonial governments. The ouster of Nkrumah in Ghana, the eruption of civil strife in Nigeria, the brutal reign of Amin in Uganda, and a host of other crises underscored the shortcomings of national independence. A decade or more of political independence had failed to bring real self-determination to former subject people. Third world nations had won formal autonomy, what the Tanzanian statesman Julius Nyerere called flag independence. But entire sectors of their economies remained in the grasp of foreign capital. Indeed, the disintegration of European empires had set the stage for new forms of exploitation. Some African American militants denounced the new crop of African and Caribbean rulers as stooges and Afro-Saxons who continued to take orders from Washington, London, and Paris. Striving to understand the global nature of oppression, the Black Panthers embraced the theory of intercommunalism. So here's a picture of Elaine Brown and Huey Newton. African Americans, intercommunalists posited, were one of the many communities around the world suffering under US imperialism. Intercommunalism suggested that the real objective of freedom struggle was not individual nationhood, but the decisive defeat of imperialism. If formal independence had not truly emancipated the disinherited masses of the Third World, national sovereignty seemed equally problematic as a framework for Black American liberation. Even dissident and embryonic models of Black nationhood exhibited what revolutionary philosopher Frantz Fanon called the pitfalls of national consciousness. Fanon believed nationalism was a double-edged sword. While it enabled the consolidation of liberation forces during the anti-colonial phase of struggle, it also brought to power an elite class of post-colonial officials committed to governing in its own narrow self-interest. So actually this picture I should explain, this is a photo of some supporters of Sekou Touré, the Guinean president. Black American expressions of nationality proved equally problematic. On one hand, the reinvigoration of nationalist consciousness enhanced the post-war African-American mass movement, raising questions of power and autonomy that had been sidelined amid the push for desegregation. The 1960s Black nationalist resurgence highlighted the strategic limitations of liberal reform and white paternal benevolence. And it encouraged dissidents to link the subjugation of African-American communities to international processes of domination and underdevelopment. So I want to be clear, I'm not dismissing the benefits, the value of Black nationalism or Black nationalist frameworks out of hand. I actually think they played a really key role. The revival of Black nationalist outlooks played a key role in transcending some of the limitations of Cold War politics. But as feminist scholar Anne McClintock reminds us, all nationalisms are gendered, all are invented, and all are dangerous, right? That's worth repeating. All nationalisms are gendered, all are invented, and all are dangerous. So regardless of the color of its progenitors, a nation state reproduces itself in part by disciplining and regimenting its subjects. To consolidate the national project, all nations subordinate more organic notions of community and belonging. Pan-African nationalist institutions in the US occasionally mirrored the hierarchies of the ruling parties and post-colonial regimes they sought to emulate. Attempts to quote unquote govern consciousness and control behavior replicated the centralized authority of the post-colonial state and elevated the prerogatives of putative authorities over the aspirations of the governed. Cultural autonomy was equated with the activities and theories of the self-identified vanguard forces of African-American liberation. And I'm going to quote Amiri Baraka from 1969. Most people are not rational, intellectual and organizer, Amiri Baraka declared, explaining Pan-African nationalism's attempt to regulate the Black rank and file. They function on a less than conscious level, he continued. The reason you have to teach people values is so they will do what is in their best interest without trying to reason about it, unquote. Thankfully, there emerged a more egalitarian ideal for conceptualizing the African-American post-colony. During the late 60s and 70s, solidarity with armed struggles against the remaining outposts of European colonial domination in Southern Africa strongly influenced Pan-Africanist politics in the US. Some US militants believed Southern Africa's liberation movements would elevate the entire Third World, eclipsing the significance of the earlier wave of nationalist campaigns. Armed struggles on the southern tip of the continent, ruled by Portuguese, South African, and Rhodesian regimes, served as emblems of revolutionary commitment within the US. Emphasis on revolutionary politics eclipsed more sentimental modes of Pan-African nationalist thought. According to a dominant political line, what linked Black Americans and Africans was not simply race or cultural heritage, but the fact that their oppression sprang from the same global structures of exploitation. Quote, "You can't understand what's going on in North Carolina until you understand what's going on in Zimbabwe," Pan-Africanists from Durham proclaimed. If the purpose of revolution was to produce, quote, "a change in the conditions of living," as Angolan freedom fighter Agostinho Neto asserted, then engagement with Southern Africa could help transform Black American realities as well. Black polemicists shifted their focus from the process of national formation in the developing world to active guerrilla campaigns against white minority rule. The concept of liberated territories began to rival the motif of nationhood as a touchstone for radical African-American consciousness. "We are citizens of Africa," Atlanta-based Pan-Africanists declared in 1970. "We have to work with other African people to build liberated zones which can emerge into the new Africa of the 21st century," unquote. Years later, in his book, Freedom Dreams, the noted Black historian Robin D.G. Kelley recalled that as a young radical growing up in Harlem, he searched, quote, "for glimmers of a new society in the liberated zones of Portugal's African colonies during the wars of independence." And as an aside, I should say that folks who have not gotten a chance to read Robin Kelley's amazing book, Freedom Dreams, should definitely check it out ASAP, as well as everything else Robin has ever written. Liberated territories were those rural areas that armed insurgents in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau had seized from colonialists and white settler regimes. Recognition of the significance of liberated territories increased among African-American activists after fall 1971, when key US Pan-Africanists, including Owusu Sadaki of North Carolina's Malcolm X Liberation University, and New York civil rights worker Robert Van Lierop, seen here, Robert Van Lierop on the far right, seen here with Samora Machel of Mozambique. When Van Lierop and Sadaki visited emancipated portions of Mozambique and spent several weeks embedded with local guerrilla forces. This act of solidarity led to the production of A Luta Continua, Van Lierop's 1972 documentary film about the Mozambican struggle. I'll play you a few minutes of the film in a moment. A Luta Continua helped raise African-American awareness about the fight against Portuguese colonialism, as did the launching of African Liberation Day, demonstrations in the US, and other solidarity activities, such as boycotts. Well-publicized accounts of life inside rebel-held swaths of Southern Africa established liberated areas or liberated zones as an important archetype of Black self-determination. In published testimonies about his experiences traversing the Mozambican interior with members of that country's liberation front, Owusu Sadaki explained that the fighters were laboring to emancipate, quote, "not just their land, but the man on it," unquote. Sadaki recounted how the guerrillas had created makeshift hospitals for the benefit of poor villagers, including peasants who had lacked access to basic services under colonialism. At one encampment, Sadaki had witnessed the organization of a makeshift school. He later recalled that, quote, "a freedom fighter, one day out of combat with the Portuguese, will put up a blackboard on a tree and with his gun still strapped over his shoulder, begin to teach these younger brothers and sisters," unquote. Sadaki's reports highlighted not the workings of a purely military operation, but the efforts of an armed cadre closely integrated with the lives of ordinary civilians and devoted to their dignity and well-being. Screenings of A Luta Continua reinforced this perspective. A Luta Continua, or the struggle continues, were the words with which Eduardo Mondlane, Frelemo's first president, ended his letters. The principle of liberated territories promised to expand the creative possibilities of Pan-African nationalist practice in the US. What were the implications of viewing Black American communities not simply as colonies awaiting national liberation, but as zones of insurgent democracy? The main concern under the latter schema was laying the foundation of the new society, rather than awaiting the rise of a national bureaucracy. The quest was not to prefigure the apparatus of a nation state, but to preview the democratic social relations of a radically just community. So what are the characteristics of liberated territories? Such territories are inchoate and contested. They are full of possibility. They are in flux. Their structures, their mechanisms of governance and distribution remain fluid and must be molded and remolded by indigenous inhabitants. The concept of liberated zones suggested that the development of alternative educational models could help guide the reconstruction of society, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. Rather than instill loyalty to an unborn nation, indigenous institutions could empower children and young adults to craft a post-revolutionary future of their own design. Rather than claim an absolute mandate, organizers could wage a permanent struggle to win the trust of the people. Teachers and leaders would fight alongside the popular masses, taking pains to avoid reproducing colonial dynamics and prioritizing the improvement of quotidian life over the ascent to formal power. Rigid gender roles would dissolve, enabling all people to wield equal authority and perform identical tasks in the struggle. Activists would strive to creatively address the everyday needs of workers and the unemployed, demonstrating on a modest scale the structural transformation that the entire society needed to undergo. The purpose of revolution was to return dignity and democratic power to the people. Meaningful post-coloniality required the construction of a new order based on qualitative changes in the lives of the laboring classes. Freedom could not be orchestrated from above. It had to be engineered from below. So I'll just conclude by talking about a liberated zone for our own time. Many grassroots Black formations pursued elements of this vision, this expansive democratic vision, through the 1970s and beyond in the form of liberation schools, urban survival programs, and radical feminist groups. Today, strands of creative utopianism have resurfaced within struggles like Black Lives Matter and the work of Cooperation Jackson, a Black collective in Mississippi. Young activists are again creating alternative institutions, from communal urban gardens to agricultural cooperatives designed to prefigure a more humane and sustainable economy. So for example, this group, Cooperation Jackson, who I suggest you Google if you don't know too much about them, have done amazing work, an autonomous, progressive collective And one of their main focuses is a sort of just transition to eco-socialism, and they try to model that in the kind of work they do with urban gardens and worker-owned cooperatives, et cetera. So many such activists are doing so, are creating alternative institutions based on a democratic worldview that explicitly rejects patriarchy, homophobia, and monopoly capitalism. They're calling for the eradication of white supremacy, as well as the fundamental transformation of social and economic relations, something that neither the post-colonial world nor the post-segregation era managed to deliver. So I'm going to repeat that. They're calling for the eradication of white supremacy, the fundamental transformation of social and economic relations, something that neither post-colonialism nor post-segregation managed to deliver. Armed with their own revolutionary frameworks, they're struggling to build a new society within the shell of the old. Long after the tides of Black power radicalism receded, marginalized Americans continued to imagine the schoolhouse as a site of political empowerment and self-determination. We still need radical democratic spaces in which people of all colors can practice theories of social reconstruction. Today, as parents, students, and activists strive to reimagine schools that have long stood as sites of civic abandonment and criminalization, a re-examination of traditions of educational dissent may prove invaluable. Okay, so I think we have enough time to play a short clip from the 1972 film, A Luta Continua. So again, this film was produced mainly by two very active, well-known African-American activists, Pan-Africanists, both of whom were associated with independent Black institutions and schools. After 1971, when they both were embedded with freedom fighters in Mozambique in Southern Africa. So this film became something of a cult hit in the early 1970s, a favorite with the New Left and with African-American internationalists in particular. So I want to play this clip, just a few minutes, but I also want to preface this by saying that I find a lot to admire in this film and in this depiction of a kind of embryonic democratic society. But I don't want to hold it forth as a model that's beyond criticism. And you may see some of the contradictions in the depiction or in the voiceover narration of Robert Van Lierop, and I'd love to discuss those. So I don't at all want to suggest that this is a kind of a perfect model. All right, now let me see if I can pull off this feed. All right, I'm going to fast forward here.
In 1962, Frelemo was organized by the merger of three separate nationalist organizations. In the course of the struggle, Frelemo has become more than just a front. It is a military and political institution, but it is also an educational institution, an agricultural institution,
Can you hear that well?
a health institution, and a social services institution. In the course of the armed struggle, Frelemo has become a revolutionary party of the masses of Mozambicans.
Leadership is based upon a concept of responsibility rather than rank. The leaders are called responsables, which in English literally means the responsibles. If one were asked to identify the leadership or policymakers of Frelemo, one need merely point to any school teacher, any peasant engaged in agricultural production, or any group of children laughing and playing in the liberated areas. In working for a common goal, people have learned to submerge their own individual egos, and individuals do not assume positions of responsibility with an idea that he or she has inherited a position of prestige or power on an individual basis. Very often, people are reassigned to different jobs and different areas of responsibility, as Frelemo strives to put people who are best able to perform in specific jobs. In this revolution, there is no distinction made in the tasks one is called upon to perform strictly because of a person's sex or age. The people of Mozambique are waging a protracted people's war. It is a protracted struggle in that it is comparable to a long-distance relay race rather than a sprint. In this sense, the revolution is a process and not an event. Frelemo's main weapons are the people of Mozambique themselves, their unity and their political consciousness. In many of the traditional societies, as in most societies, particularly under colonialism, women were assigned an inferior status. They drew water, gathered wood, and bore.
Russell, sorry, we've lost the sound.
It's the sound. Lost the sound. I think it's because you went on mute.
Performed only by men.
Sorry
only
about
by
that.
Women.
Hold on, I'll back it up a few seconds.
Today, in the liberated areas of Mozambique, the Frelemo guerrilla army sets an example of mobilization and effective utilization of all components. No job is performed only by men or only by women. Men and women engage in various aspects of military activities. Men and women serve as teachers and medical cadre. Men and women cook, sew, and perform other housekeeping chores. Naturally, these changes did not occur overnight, and the process of change in the status of women is continuing. In 1967, the first group of women began full-scale political and military training in order to make them more capable of fulfilling whatever task the revolution might require. In some areas, the people were literally amazed to see women in uniforms, carrying weapons, and functioning as part of a disciplined command structure. The people of Mozambique are the first to say that they still have a way to go in changing the status of women, just as they have a long way to go in all other aspects of the struggle. However, revolution must be viewed as a dynamic process with constant change. Just as a long-distance relay team gets stronger and stronger each day of application, and just as the seeds of a mango tree undergo a change from seeds to tree, getting stronger and more firmly rooted in the process, so too grows the revolution in Mozambique and all of its changes and dynamics. Today, in the liberated areas of Mozambique, young girls are attending school in large numbers for the very first time. The life which they grow into will be very different from that which older women grew into.
One of Frelemo's first priorities has been education. The first president of Frelemo, Eduardo Munlan, who was assassinated by Portuguese agents in 1969, had this to say about education.
We have always attached such great importance to education because, in the first place, it is essential for the development of our struggle, since the involvement and support of the population increase as the understanding of the situation grows. In the second place, a future independent Mozambique will be in very grave need of educated citizens to lead the way in development.
In the liberated areas, primary or elementary schools were established with very basic materials. Where classrooms exist, they are built by the students and teachers themselves out of the materials found in the forest or bush. For the first time, students are being taught very basic skills: how to read and write, how to add and subtract, something about themselves and their country. They learn about Africa, its past, its present, and its future. Every day in their lives, the future of Mozambique and the rest of Africa is being shaped. In their lives, education is not a way for them to achieve upward mobility or isolate themselves as an intellectual elite, nor is it a meaningless abstraction which leads to dependence upon external economic conditions. Instead, they are learning these basic skills so that they can teach others of their people the same skills. Plus, in their daily lives, they know the importance of being able to count the number of soldiers, planes, and bombs that the enemy uses. Even though there are no expensive school buildings or other such facilities, the work of education goes forward, as the most important components of any school are students willing to learn, teachers willing to teach, and a common motivation to achieve a common goal or objective. The students and teachers work together in this respect. When school is out, the teachers do not go one way into cars for a trip home to exclusive suburbs, while the students go another way, deeper into a ghetto. Instead, they are all part of the same mass movement, and the teachers live, work, and struggle in the bush with all of the people. You will never hear of teachers from Frelemo striking because they've been asked to perform so-called non-professional duties. You will never hear of teachers from Frelemo striking over issues which affect only their own economic interests at the expense of the community. You will never hear of students or teachers being disrespectful of each other or assaulting each other. No one is a specialist, and in the course of the struggle, everyone is called upon to perform many tasks.
Okay, as compelling as those scenes are, I think maybe we should open it up so that we can have just about 30 minutes to discuss. So let me stop sharing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So as we move to this part of our program today, we're going to use the Zoom raise your hand feature to pose questions. So for those of you who don't spend your lifetimes on Zoom, you'll see that down in the taskbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen is a reactions icon. If you click on that reactions icon, you can then click on the raise your hand button. So I encourage those of you who would like to start off our discussion to go ahead and pose a question.
I think Mark was raising his hand.
Yes, I think Mark, I see your little Zoom hand. Not quite the one I was expecting, but yeah, jump in, Mark. And you'll need to unmute yourself, Mark.
the one thing that comes to mind, and maybe it's because I read too much the New York Times, but what is the place of religion in all of this? I mean, there is a religious tradition for all of these people. And this religious tradition can be very, very powerful, and it can connect them with other parts of the world as well. So I just wondered, I mean, it sounds as if that was just put aside and not, you know, doesn't become part of it. Rather, this idealistic communalism, working together, supporting one another, becomes primary.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the first thing I should say is that the attention, the sort of political emphasis on Southern African freedom struggles as political models, as political influences, it certainly reinforced and benefited from the more radical elements within the Black Power movement in the US. So certainly revolutionary nationalists and other radicals, including Black internationalists, Pan-Africanists who drew on, Marxist ideas and notions of third world liberation. But none of them were, practically none of them were sort of orthodox Marxist-Leninists, and wouldn't have rejected, religion out of hand as say, the opiate of the masses or anything like that. That having been said, one of the, I think one of the remarkable aspects of the shift away from a focus on the nation state toward the possibilities of active revolution, armed struggle, and crafting the new society from below, right, as it were, was that, as I sort of suggested in the talk, it was kind of a throwaway line, but it helped to discredit more kind of sentimental and backward-looking notions of sort of Black global affinity that are based on ideas of racial essence on one hand, based on sort of looking backward to, a supposed golden age of Africa, the ancient societies of Mali or Ghana or Songhai, whatever. And also this, as part of that, this emphasis that cultural nationalists in the United States had in particular on traditionalism, right? And on resurrecting tradition, the notion that for Black people to really fulfill their identity as Africans rather than Negroes, that they needed to somehow restore, whatever they considered, whatever was regarded as African tradition, right? Which often meant, trying to revive, some of the most backward aspects of feudal societies. So, with the sort of close scrutiny, close attention to the process of African revolution, revolutionaries like Amilcar Cabral and others that were mentioned in the talk, their ideas about crafting modern societies that were both modern in many ways, in terms of gender equality, in terms of other egalitarian ideas, but that were not modeled on the West, that were not about mimicking the colonial master or colonial civilizations, European or Western civilizations, but are really about, as Fanon said, about building the new society, setting afoot the new person, right? He said the new man, setting afoot the new man. So I think that's a key distinction. And certainly, obviously, I'm quite sure religion could play a role in that new society. I'm not a big religious person myself. I'm kind of a secularist. But the point was that whatever the shape of the new society, it would be constructed by marginalized people themselves, that their needs, their material realities would be paramount, rather than the notions, the ideas, religious or cultural or otherwise, of any sort of elite.
Thank you. Let's turn the floor over to Donald Nobles. Donald, would you like to unmute yourself and jump in?
I think you're still muted, Donald.
Not anymore.
Right on.
Okay. I have a couple of large questions, and they're separate, but the first one is the situation in Mozambique is, it seems to me, a theory, and I'm jaded by experience. The concept that everyone can be equal, that everyone can be a leader at one point or another, doesn't hold up in any experience I've ever seen or read about. So help me with this. How is that going to help them, particularly because they're carrying guns? And as soon as the oppressor decides they're in the way, they will be annihilated. The same way the American Indians were, the same way the Black Panthers were. So if you take that first part, and then if I get another chance, I'll ask you the next question.
Okay, well, I'll try and be uncharacteristically short so I can hear that next question, because I like I like this line of inquiry. So first, I should say that it's important to note that neither the American Indians nor the Black Panthers were eliminated, although it wasn't for lack of trying. And we should note, of course, particularly because we just observed Indigenous Peoples Day, we should also note that many Black Panthers remain imprisoned and in exile. So we should sort of keep them in mind as we discuss the question of liberation. Nor were the guerrilla fighters in Mozambique or Angola or anywhere else in the Southern African struggles, including South Africa itself, nor were they wiped out. In fact, they were victorious, right? I mean, they suffered heavy losses. But any liberation movement, every liberation movement suffers heavy losses, right? I think there's no question that this, the political imaginary, the utopian political imagination of African-American internationalists, of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, unfolded in a very particular moment, right? It was a moment that was infused with the pessimism on one hand that had followed the collapse and the degradation of an earlier wave of African independence and third world independence movement. So there's no question that cynicism that you're talking about, that in many ways I share, Donald, right, was there because people had seen the ways in which formal independence had failed the masses of people. That was what was so powerful in many ways about the resurgence of armed struggle on the African continent, because it seemed to unfold within a new context and to produce a new crop of leaders that explicitly rejected the conservative, inadequate models of statehood and formal sovereignty that were that had been discredited, right, by so many of these African-American activists. And without spending the next 6 or 7 hours answering this question, which is what I would like to do.
That's how long it would take.
I mean, I wanna again invoke an idea that, again, you know, the historian Robin Kelley has helped to popularize, which is the notion of the radical imagination, right? So the fact that there was this touch point, this ideal of liberated territories, helped unlock the imaginations of many activists who, by the way, were also engaged in the day-to-day activities of so many of you, right? They were teaching, they were creating curricula, they were building institutions, right? And they were thinking about, and actively practicing the socialization of children. So I'm going to suggest that there was a profound connection between the possibilities that they saw, however realistic we may deem them, and the day-to-day practices inside and outside of the classroom that they considered part of revolution. So I'll take a quick follow-up comment for you, and then we'll take another couple questions, and I'll try and come back around to all of them.
But the second question was, as succinctly as you can, what did you try to do today in your talk?
That sounds like a grad school question. I'm glad you asked me that. I tried to show that during the late 1960s and early 1970s, a set of African-American militants drawing upon the political inspiration from the revolutionary world and from revolutionary Southern Africa in particular, rethought their models of liberation. And they rethought their models of liberation in ways that allowed for a far more expansive and rigorous conception of democracy. And that conception of democracy reshaped their institutions and their organizations. And I think it can continue to inspire us today, notwithstanding its shortcomings, its internal contradictions, and its blind spots.
Thank you. Nakoma, would you like to jump in?
Hello, thank you for your talk. So I'm a teacher, and like most of us here, and you know, it's been a year of trauma, and it's all starting to come out in the classrooms. Like it's the kids are not okay. They are not okay. And I know that part of the answer to helping them deal with their trauma is to, you know, use these sort of approaches to learning that are highly, highly relevant and highly, highly communal. At the same time, though, there's the trauma, there's also the world of social media, and then there's this whole lack of experience relatively that they have with interacting like as person to person. And so my question for you is, like, how can we learn from these wonderful examples from the past, given our current context in which it's difficult for folks to literally speak and listen to one another, or even to sit in quiet. Like their anxiety rises. You can see them practically vibrating with things, which makes it hard to sort of sit with these heavy ideas and have that radical imagination, because it starts to feel like pressure for them.
And Cuomo, I think that's a really profound question, and I hope that you all are able to discuss it more broadly at the end of the hour. I will say that I'm sure many of you have far better answers to this than I do, and I'd love for you to chime in after I offer my thoughts and before the next question is asked. But here are some very sort of loose thoughts. I should also say that, you know, as a professor as a teacher at the college level, I see some evidence of the same trauma in my students. You know, for the most part, they're much more practiced at concealing it, but the kids are not all right. You know, that's the bottom line. That the trauma is deep and profound. And so, of course, I mean, the irony is that, as you all well know, the pandemic is exacerbating, you know, deep-seated existing inequities and disparities, and we're ill-equipped as a society, as a civilization, to deal with that. I think I want to return to the early months of the pandemic that for me seemed both bleak and seemed more full of hope than things appeared perhaps a year plus in, or even the way things appear now. And the reason why there were glimmers of hope, and perhaps there may still be glimmers of hope, is that the exigencies of the pandemic seem to be forcing in real time a very creative, collective rethinking of how we live, right? And I think the ruling elites had not quite regrouped yet, right? They hadn't quite learned how to discipline us in this potentially insurgent moment, and how to recapture our attention, how to recapture our labor, et cetera. And so people were rethinking how we live, right? How we reproduce ourselves. And it seemed that society was producing, you know, intriguing proposals about how we might reconstruct, you know, ourselves, how we might reconstruct civilization, how we might do things differently. And a cliche emerged that basically said, we can't go back to where we were. Where we were was unsustainable, right? Where we were was rotten, but in fact, this crisis has highlighted just how untenable it really was. So I don't know how to heal the children. I'm desperately trying to, you know, to do so for my own daughter. But I do believe that we need to try and recapture that spirit of the early weeks when, as in the case with the liberated territories, things were very much in flux. And while, there was tremendous fear and anxiety, there was also a sense of hope, and there was a proliferation of mutual aid efforts. There's still a very robust mutual aid network that greatly expanded here in where I live in Tompkins County, upstate New York, that greatly expanded in the context of the pandemic and is doing amazing work. So I think that's a partial answer, but I'm wondering if before we go to the other hands that are up, if anybody else wanted to speak to that. And again, I do really hope that you discuss it further at the end of the hour.
Jean, jump in.
Well, as you're talking about hope and the changes, I work in school administration, and it seems like after that hope, what you saw was a doubling down on the power structures through which decisions are being made at school. So that would be either that top-down bureaucratic approach that you get in the city, right? Or if you're in the suburbs like me, what you're seeing is this kind of grassroots tribalism that's erupting at school board meetings. So, from my point of view, what you're seeing is just like we're overcompensating in a way that seems even more difficult to work our way out of. Mm-hmm. I was hoping that maybe we could get some insight from that Black Power movement that in a way to confront those two different power systems through which decisions are made, because if there's one thing I'm taking from this talk is that by expanding our worldview, we can find other ways in which to make decisions or figure out how these important decisions about how education are being made.
Right, sure.
Thank you, Jean. Ilan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Professor Rickford, for your talk and for sharing your time with us. And, I guess wanted to offer some thoughts about this question. That, even though it feels certainly true that like pregnant moment of possibility feels closed, I also think, and I try to emphasize this to my students, not just in response to the pandemic, but in general, that we did win things. And in that moment where things felt possible, things did change. And, in New York State, we did pass various police reform in response to George Floyd. I'm a teacher organizer. Like in New York City, the teacher unionism is much stronger than it was before the pandemic. We have a lot more power than we did. And, the mutual aid networks that you're pointing to are, massively stronger than they used to be. And I think that those are enduring changes that we fought for and won during the pandemic. And I think that like sharing those moments of hope is really important. And the last thing, I'm sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, is like, I think something else that I want to take away and share with my students is that, the moment where things opened with the twin tragedies of COVID and George Floyd, the moment they opened was unforeseeable, right? It appeared out of nowhere in a matter of months. And I think that that's also something we want to tell our young people, that we have to be ready for these moments where the world can change, because they're not always predictable, but they're coming and they're there. And it's incumbent upon us to be organized and ready, and incumbent upon them, when we pass the world on. So sorry.
Yeah, don't at all apologize. I think that was quite beautiful. I mean, I don't want to I don't want to I mean, what you said was actually quite generative. And I don't want to filibuster. I know we have other hands, but let me just say briefly in response that look, I mean, you're absolutely right that those openings did force major concessions, but even more importantly than the sort of whatever formal concessions they forced, the anti-racist struggle and activism around the conditions of COVID and frontline workers, et cetera, is that it opened new horizons of possibility, and it allowed people to rethink politics, and it allowed people to rethink the possibilities of collective action. But those changes only come in the context of a mass struggle. They come in the context of a collective effort of a people struggle, right? So, you know, those concessions, those reforms, those advances could not have come about if it weren't for, you know, for example, those series of wildcat strikes, right, that were radicalizing the structures of trade unionism and the labor movement, right? You saw toward the end of the clip from the film that there's a critique of a kind of conservative craft unionism. I mean, this is sort of specifically hearkening back to the late 1960s, you know, New York City, you know, education wars and the struggles for community control on one hand, and the sort of, you know, teacher professionalization and the teacher unions on the other. But the notion is that, I mean, in the film, the teachers union is kind of rejected as this, you know, decadent, individualist, petty bourgeois formation, and there may be elements of truth to that. But I guess the larger point for me is that that to the extent that we have gone through a process of reconditioning, that I get your point, that there's still possibilities for reopening the question of society, that this is not settled, that it's not complete. And yeah, as Comrade pointed out earlier, that, you know, the ruling class is regrouped, but, you know, in my best moments, I try to fight off despair and keep in mind those transformative possibilities. And that's why I do believe that that these, you know, models of grassroots democracy, right, whether it's the Zapatistas, whether it's Cooperation Jackson, wherever we may find them, are really valuable, and we need to nurture them, and we need to teach them as well.
Thank you. We are very nearly out of time, and I see that we've lost Candace, who posed a question in the chat. But Candace asks, how does this historical dive tie into today's Black futurist movement?
It's a good question. I'm not sure how to answer that. How does, I'm not seeing the question in the chat. She said, how does
this historical dive tie into today's Black futurist movement?
Yeah, well, I certainly am no authority on, you know, Afro futurist visions, but I actually think that the kind of world making that was exhibited in the film and in the political imaginations of these activists was a very sort of profound notion of Afrofuturity, right? And I mean, look, you know, in the context of ecological catastrophe, I think one has to be audacious to even speak about the future, to dream of the future, right? And I think that that's when, you know, when we talk about the trauma of our children, nobody understands this better than they do. You know, nobody understands, you know, the trouble that we're in, and the obscenity of our inaction, more than our children, right? And we deserve their condemnation, unless we can somehow, you know, marshal the collective effort that we need to rebel, to raise hell, to bring about the changes that are necessary. So, yes, the pandemic is an additional challenge. It is paralyzing. It is demobilizing at the precise moment that we need to be, to be launching, collective action. And we need to find ways to fight through it, and we need to find ways to inspire our children and inspire our young people, and equip them with the tools that they need to rethink society. So I do think we're still charged as thinkers, as educators, to find ways to transform a very bleak moment and a very isolating moment into a moment of growing collectivism and radical democracy.